Today we're discussing chapter 20, Waves of Revolution. Frankly, this is one of my favorite chapters in the book because I think this is a real turning point in world history. The colonial empires in the Western Hemisphere largely collapse. A lot of the older political states in Asia fall apart. And the stage is really set for what becomes the modern world. Well, let's talk about things. Now, in Asia, we see the collapse in Iran. Basically, that state, the Safavid state, was not able to maintain itself. And warriors came in from Central Asia, or what nowadays would be Afghanistan, South Asia, and overwhelmed it. And Iran did not reconstitute itself, really until the 20th century. I mean, it stayed pretty fractured. In India, we see the collapse of the Mughal dynasty. And interestingly enough, what we do see is that the British end up coming in and becoming a major force in India, particularly after the Battle of Plessy. We see that the British are able to establish themselves as major players. And this is significant because throughout the 18th century, we see European powers become stronger and stronger. Particularly, we see, like, for instance, the 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, which in America is known as the French and Indian War, was a battle between the French and the British for control of trade and colonial assets throughout the world. All the way from the area, where you all are located, Illinois and in the area between the Mississippi and the Ohio River valleys, all the way to the Caribbean, to Africa, to India, to Southeast Asia, and of course up into Canada. And what we see is that the British were able to push back the French. The British were able to get control of most of India. They were able to push the French out of Canada. And the British established themselves as dominant in Asia. And they established themselves as dominant in North America. The French, however, were able to maintain control of their valuable Caribbean assets. Martinique, Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, a number of other places in the Caribbean they were able to hold on to, which, from the French perspective, was not a bad deal because, frankly, the islands in the Caribbean were far and away the most valuable territory they had. Now, from the French perspective, hindsight's always 20/20. We historians have the advantage of knowing how things ended. From the French perspective, had they just licked their wounds after the 7 Years' War, they would have come out of the situation with a smaller empire, but they would have been in a better economic situation. And they would have ended up pretty doggone rich. But since this was an era of rivalry, after the French were defeated in the 7 Years' War, they really wanted to get back at the British. And so what we see is that in what would become the United States, the colonists in the United States were not happy because the 7 Years' War, as some people say, some people refer to it as the First World War because the British and the French fought in several different continents. But the British, although they won the war, it cost them a lot of money. I mean, they were sending navies all around the world. They were sending soldiers all around the world. And it took 7 years. It was a long conflict. So even though they won the war, they had to pay a lot of money in order to win it. And from the British perspective, they were saying, well, look, by winning this war, we actually secured the position of the American colonies. In particular, the 13 colonies that would become the nucleus of the United States. And from their perspective, they would say, well, it's only fair that these American colonists pay an increase in taxes, because by winning this war, we guaranteed their security. Now, as all of you all know, being students in America, the American colonists did not see it that way. Over the previous 150 or so years, all of the colonial systems had developed a degree of independence. They all had legislatures in which local people who had property, and this was white men. I mean, blacks were property. They didn't measure in the citizenship equation. Native Americans weren't counted. Matter of fact, in the very first census the United States ever had, Native Americans literally were not counted. The people who were counted in the first census, which is a little bit ahead of where we are right now, were the whites and black slaves. And so, but the bottom line is that, in the period of colonial history, say from about 1607, which is the founding of Jamestown, up until the founding of up until the end of the 7 Years' War, all of the various colonies had legislatures, and all of the prominent local people were used to having influence over the government. But because of the financial difficulty that the British found themselves in because of the 7 Years' War, the British were like, nah, we're going to tax you all. We're going to recoup some of the money that we spent. And as we all know, in particular, this meant that the British gained more control over exports. They wanted, and they also wanted to tax things that were brought into the colonies. In particular, things like tea, paper, naval stores, stuff like tar that was used in making ships, that sort of thing. All of these things they wanted to tax. And the American colonial people, they felt this was unfair. And as was mentioned in the previous chapter, the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas that government should be representative, the idea that people should have a word in government, the people who felt that they weren't being treated fairly, they looked at these ideologies and said, look, we should have a voice in government. And as we all know, this ends up becoming what in the United States is known as the Revolutionary War, which goes on from 1775 or 1776, depending on how you want to count it, until 1783, when the British finally recognized American independence. Now, it's a long struggle, and frankly, the British have a significant military advantage. General George Washington, who was the main military leader, did not have a lot of great victories. What he was good at was keeping his troops together and basically kind of fighting a rearguard action. I mean, in a lot of ways, America did not really fight a guerrilla war. I mean, the term was not yet invented. But America did fight a war of a country that had inferior resources compared to the British. And that's not surprising. America had about 1 million people. Britain was much larger. And this was 1 million people scattered over about 500,000 or so square miles. And so the United States, or what would become the United States, was very thinly populated. And so it was kind of a scattered conflict. But the bottom line is that America would eventually win the war. And after a period of time where it had Articles of Confederation, which was a very loose form of government. Eventually, by 1787, the current Constitution would be put into effect, and you'd have the constitutional system that we still have until this day. Not exactly the same thing, but the basic glue of the system, the Constitution, had come in effect by that time. Now, as I said before, if the French had simply gone off and allowed themselves to recover after losing the 7 Years' War, they would have come out of the 7 Years' War in very good economic shape. However, they didn't do that. They wanted to get some payback on the British. And so what the French did, along with the Spanish, but really primarily the French, was that they gave a lot of money and military support to the Americans. And this is significant because, as the book mentions, when the British finally surrendered at the Battle of Yorktown, it's the French Navy and French forces that sealed the deal. There were more French guys out there fighting than there were Americans. And so America literally would not have won the war, or they definitely wouldn't have won it as quickly as they did, without the French. The French were really America's first really close ally, which is kind of ironic considering over the years there's kind of a subculture of French jokes in America, but really the French were the crucial ally in winning. However, the French paid a high price for this. France overextended itself financially, and it ended up in a situation where there just simply was not enough resources to maintain French society. And in France in particular, this was a difficult situation because, from Louis the 13th through the 14th to the 15th to the 16th, France had developed a very strong culture of political absolutism, royal absolutism, that the king, like Louis the 14th had a famous saying, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state. And so, unlike Britain, which emerged from the British, the English Revolution, or the English Civil War, with an enhanced parliamentary system, the French ended up, firmly autocratic, with a absolute monarchy. And so, as the economic situation got worse, eventually, Louis XVI finds himself turning to an old tradition that had not been enacted in about 170 years, which was the Estates General. And the Estates General basically was a sort of parliament in which people were recognized by their status. Now, basically, you had three estates in France. You had the first estate, which was the church; the second estate, which was the nobility; the third estate, which was everybody else. Now, the first two estates were very tiny. They were small groups in terms of population. The third estate was by far the biggest estate, but instead of a parliamentary system where individual members of parliament voted, groups voted by estate, which meant that the third estate, which was the regular people, always got outvoted because the first estate and the second estate stuck together. However, because things got so bad, when the Estates General was called in, there was eventually a movement towards liberalizing things. And so this literally opened up a can of worms for the French monarchy. This meant that people began to demand changes, and Louis XVI, conceded. But what eventually happened was that he lost control of the situation. And by 1792, he found himself without a head. And, we get into the really the deep part of the French Revolution. Now, the most intense part of the French Revolution was that period from about 1793 until about 1795 or so, when you have, this was the period when the Jacobins were in charge. And this is what's known as the Terror. Now, the interesting thing about the term terror is that what was meant by terror was that the Jacobins, the party that was radically democratic, they were going to rain terror down on their enemies. And of course, this period of the revolution was very famous for being extremely bloody. About 17,000 folks found themselves without a head by the time this was over. And so, and basically, the Jacobins tried to completely restructure the state. They got rid of the church. They created a whole new set of years. They created new months. They did everything differently. Now, one of the interesting things, however, is that as this revolution was going on in France, there was also major pressure in Saint-Domingue, modern day Haiti. Haiti was the richest of the French Caribbean possessions, and it was an island with a great majority, about 90% of the population were slaves. Either Creole slaves who had been born in Saint-Domingue, or they were recent imports. And in a plantation system like you had in Saint-Domingue, there was a very large percentage of new slaves always being brought over, because the plantation was so brutal that slaves tended not to last very long. I mean, on average, a slave that was brought to Saint-Domingue lived less than 10 years. And so the rate of natural reproduction of slaves in Saint-Domingue was very low. And so that meant that new slaves were constantly being brought in, which was a very, very different situation from the United States, because the United States is kind of an oddball country when it comes to slavery, in that, especially around the Chesapeake Bay area from Maryland to Virginia, there was always a really high birth rate among slaves. And so this meant that, unlike the Caribbean, the black population in what would become the United States became culturally very distinctive from Africans, because people were born in America. There was a breakaway from the old languages or from the old culture. And then also, slave masters really did not encourage or outlawed old practices like drumming. Whereas in the Caribbean, since there was always a constant influx of new slaves coming in, cultural ties to Africa remained much stronger. And so, that's why when you hear Brazilian music or Cuban music, you hear a lot of African drumming. Accents are much closer. Caribbean accents tend to be closer to African sounding accents than American accents, except for in rare situations like, say, Gullah people in South Carolina or Georgia. I say American people tend to be more distinctive. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up in the case of Saint-Domingue, which modern day Haiti, is that, as your book mentions, in the lead up to the war, a lot of young men were being enslaved in what nowadays would be the Democratic Republic of Congo, and were being brought to Saint-Domingue. These were young men, young healthy men, the kind of guys who would be soldiers. And it just so happens that a lot of these guys got captured and sent to Saint-Domingue because there had been soldiers back home. And so this meant that at a time when you had political instability, you had a lot of young men who knew how to fight and who had been organized in the military being brought to Saint-Domingue. And because there was such a large population of slaves, and because there was such a turnover, there was not an effort, like you saw in the Americas, to keep slaves who spoke the same language away from each other. And so this meant that as things deteriorated, these slaves were able to get together and organize. And so this meant that as the French Revolution was going on in France, you had the Creole population in Saint-Domingue, the whites, who were, the rich whites, the poor whites, and mixed race people who were often free but had inferior social status. They were all fighting to improve their situation. But what we see is that the slaves themselves took the initiative to fight for their freedom. And eventually, Toussaint Louverture, a Creole slave, emerged as the ruler. Now, one of the really significant things about the French Revolution is that during the period of the Terror, the Jacobins actually ended slavery. And we see that under Toussaint Louverture, there was an attempt to have a free population in Haiti. Now, this transition didn't necessarily go all that smoothly because the Haitian economy, or the Saint Domingue economy, which would be the proper term at that time, was a plantation economy that really depended on forced labor. And it shouldn't be rocket science, or it shouldn't surprise anybody that when a slave no longer had to do slave work, they didn't volunteer to do it. And Toussaint Louverture was in the odd position of kind of having to make people go back to do plantation work in order to keep the economy going. However, what we see is that in France by 1795, the Jacobin period had been defeated. Robespierre, who had been the leader of the Jacobins, he made the big mistake. One day, he had been, a lot of people have been executed over the years. And, one day he went before the legislature in France, and he made a speech saying, there are certain people that are going to get it in the near future. Now, since thousands of people have been decapitated, everybody in the legislature was like, am I next? Am I next? People were scared to death, started feeling on their neck, saying, am I going to be the next one? So what happens is that, since Robespierre made this really vague threat, people say, look, we're going to get this man before he gets us. And so they captured Robespierre, and, he ended up, in two pieces, kind of like King did a few years earlier. And so that ends the Terror. But what eventually happens is that a more conservative government known as the Directorate, a non-democratic government with about 5 guys in charge, they take over. These guys are more conservative. A lot of them are looking at Saint Domingue saying, look, we need to bring back slavery. We ain't getting paid. Money is not being made down in these plantations anymore because these slaves are free. And eventually, Napoleon Bonaparte, the great Corsican general, comes to power, and Napoleon is pretty conservative in issues of race. And, frankly, the guy, for lack of a better word, man was straight up racist. And, the idea of having free black folks, he could not abide by it. And so he brought back slavery and sent the French army down there. Now, as the book mentions, one of the great advantages that the Haitians had, in addition to having people who were pretty good fighters and good tacticians, I always say, if you want to get a good idea of how the Haitians fought, there's an old book that was written about 90 years ago by the Trinidadian scholar C.L.R. James called The Black Jacobins. If you ever, in matter of fact, in our textbook, there's actually a segment from that book, in chapter 20. But if you really want to get a good idea of how the Haitians organized, read The Black Jacobins. Great book. And, it tells about how they organized and how they fought. But in addition to their fighting skills, however, one of the great advantages they had was yellow fever, malaria. Haiti was a tropical place, and you had all these dudes coming from Northern Europe who had no resistance to tropical diseases coming down there fighting these folks. And, not only did they have to worry about getting shot by Haitians, they had to worry about getting sick and dying. And so disease was always a great ace in the hole for the Haitians. And so what we see is that by 1802, the French pull out, and significantly for the United States, Napoleon says, hey, I might as well sell Louisiana. He had gotten Louisiana from the Spanish, but, since the war plans in Saint Domingue / Haiti weren't working, he sold Louisiana dirt cheap to America. Thomas Jefferson was president at the time. And basically, if you're over here in Illinois, where I am, I stand up on the bluff and look across the Mississippi River. That was the land that Napoleon sold to the United States. Now, the bottom line is that Haiti got its independence, but the colonial leadership was scared to death of Haiti because slavery was an integral part of these colonial economies. In the United States, for instance, South Carolina was a majority black colony. It grew rice to feed slaves in the English-speaking Caribbean colonies. Georgia had a huge slave population. North Carolina did. Virginia did. Maryland did. Even New York. A lot of people don't realize it, but in the 17th century, about 1 out of every 6 people in New York was a slave. And one of the biggest slave graveyards in America is in Manhattan. Nowadays when you go through Manhattan, down there where Wall Street is and all that stuff, a lot of people don't realize that was a slave graveyard. A lot of people forgot about that until the early 1990s when they were building a new federal building. And people started doing excavation. All of a sudden, they started running across these graves. Then they looked back in the records and realized that about 20,000 black people were buried there. And so the point to be made is that slavery was a big thing all throughout the Americas. And so America was scared to death of Haiti getting its independence. The British weren't happy about it. The Spanish weren't happy about it. And so as a result, and the French, of course, they were sore because they lost all this big money. As a matter of fact, about 20 years after getting its independence, the French would come back to Haiti with their navy, and they would threaten to blow up Haiti if Haiti didn't pay them money. So Haiti is probably the only country in history that won a war and had to pay reparations for winning. The Haitians had to pay the French government money from 1825 until about 1947. They had to pay to be free. And the French were able to get away with this because nobody would recognize Haiti. America wouldn't recognize Haiti until the Civil War. And so as a result, Haiti was isolated, and really Haiti's never really caught a break since that time, and which is why Haiti still is the poorest country in the hemisphere. But Haiti was the country in which the revolutionary notion of independence, went further than anywhere else. Now, the last part of the Americas to really push off the colonial influence were the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking parts of America. Now, once again, Napoleon plays a role in this because Napoleon invades Spain, he invades Portugal. Now, as the book mentions, the Spanish fought very hard against the French. Matter of fact, the term guerrilla, the guerrilla war, gets started there in Spain. But what we see is that the Spanish monarch, the Portuguese monarch, they flee to the Americas, and this opens up a situation where in the Americas, there had been a pretty rigid system of the society. Whites who were born in Europe, peninsulares, they had the highest status. Then Creole whites, those whites who were born in the Americas, they were second. Then you had the castas, people who were mixed race. Then you had Native Americans. Then you had slaves at the very bottom. And so it was a very segmented society. But what we see is that from about 1810 until the mid-1820s, you have a number of different struggles in the Americas, until finally by the 1820s, the Spanish are out. Now in Brazil, you have a different situation where the Portuguese monarchy comes to Brazil, and but they eventually come back. But the son of the king stays in Brazil, and Brazil peacefully transitions to an independent country. I mean, for a while, Brazil has a monarchy, but eventually becomes a republic. And so, but the interesting thing about the Americas is that the Americas, splinters into a number of different countries. It has a very, very divided population because of the racial hierarchy. And as a result, the Americas don't really have the cohesiveness to really develop economically quickly like the United States did. And so as a result, you have a number of smaller countries, and you have lingering issues of poverty and class that are still being dealt with to a large degree. Well, anyway, I hope this was a good overview for you guys. Have a good day.